Welcome to Bloody Moon, where shadows come to life and howls echo through the night. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel to support us. It's very important to us. Don't forget to leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from and give us a like to feed our appetite for stories. All of this because the full moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering through the curtains of Jack Thompson's bedroom window. Shadows danced across the worn floorboards, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Jack tossed and turned in his sleep, sweat beading on his forehead as he battled unseen demons in his dreams. Suddenly, a bone-chilling howl pierced the night air, echoing through the dense Oregon forest surrounding his isolated cabin. Jack's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest like a jackhammer. He sat up abruptly, gasping for air, his gaze darting around the room as he tried to shake off the lingering tendrils of his nightmare. What the hell was that? He muttered to himself, running a shaky hand through his disheveled hair. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Jack noticed something odd. His bedroom door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the draft. He frowned, certain he had closed it before going to bed. A sense of unease crept over him as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Hello," he called out tentatively. "Is anyone there?" Only silence greeted him. Jack reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling for the switch. As light flooded the room, he gasped in shock. His clothes were in tatters, caked with mud and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Leaves and twigs clung to the fabric, as if he'd been rolling around in the underbrush. "What the?" Jack trailed off, his mind reeling. He had no memory of going outside, let alone engaging in any activity that could have left him in such a state. The last thing he remembered was settling into bed with a book, the full moon rising outside his window. Stumbling to his feet, Jack made his way to the bathroom, his legs wobbling beneath him as if he'd run a marathon. He flicked on the harsh fluorescent light and found himself face to face with a stranger in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed and wild. Scratches marred his face and arms, angry red lines that looked like they'd been made by animal claws. "This can't be happening," Jack whispered, leaning closer to examine the wounds. They were fresh, still oozing in places. He touched one gingerly, wincing at the sting. "How did I get these?" A wave of nausea washed over him, and Jack gripped the edges of the sink, his knuckles turning white. As he did so, he noticed something dark beneath his fingernails. Bringing his hand closer to his face, his stomach lurched. It was blood, dried and caked under every nail. Jack's mind raced, trying to piece together what could have happened. Had he sleepwalked? Been attacked by an animal? Or worse, had he attacked something or someone else? The possibilities made his head spin. A sharp knock at the front door made Jack jump, nearly slipping on the bathroom tile. "Jack? You in there, buddy?" It was his neighbor, Tom, his voice muffled through the wooden door. "Everything okay? Heard some weird noises coming from your place last night." Panic gripped Jack's chest. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. Yeah, Tom," he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. Just a bit under the weather. Think I might have caught that flu that's going around." There was a pause before Tom replied, "All right, if you say so. Let me know if you need anything, okay?" "Will do, thanks." Jack waited until he heard Tom's footsteps retreating before letting out a shaky breath. He had to pull himself together, figure out what was going on. Jack stripped off his tattered clothes, stuffing them into a garbage bag. He'd burn them later, erasing any evidence of whatever had happened. As he stepped into the shower, letting the hot water cascade over his battered body, his mind churned with questions. The scratches stung under the spray, but Jack barely noticed. He scrubbed himself raw, as if he could wash away not just the dirt and blood, but the entire inexplicable experience. As he watched the rust-colored water swirl down the drain, a memory flashed in his mind, running through the woods, the wind in his face, the scent of prey in his nostrils. Jack shook his head violently, dismissing the image. It had to be a fragment of his nightmare, nothing more. After drying off and dressing in clean clothes, Jack forced himself to eat a light breakfast, though his stomach roiled with each bite. He needed to act normal, to convince himself that there was a rational explanation for all of this. As he sipped his coffee, Jack's gaze was drawn to the calendar hanging on his kitchen wall. The full moon was clearly marked last night. He frowned, remembering the old stories his grandfather used to tell about the full moon and the strange things that happened during it. But those were just stories, weren't they? The shrill ring of his phone cut through Jack's thoughts. He answered it automatically, his voice hoarse. "Hello? Jack, where the hell are you?" It was his boss, Bill, and he sounded furious. "You were supposed to be at the logging site an hour ago." Jack glanced at the clock, cursing under his breath. He completely lost track of time. "I'm sorry, Bill. I'm not feeling well. I think I've got that flu that's going around." Bill's tone softened slightly. "Ah, hell. Not you too. Half the crew's out with that bug. All right, get some rest and let me know when you're back on your feet." "Thanks, Bill. I will." Jack hung up, guilt gnawing at him for the lie. But how could he explain what had really happened when he didn't understand it himself? As the day wore on, Jack found himself jumping at every sound, peering out the windows as if expecting to see some monstrous creature lurking in the shadows of the forest. He tried to distract himself with TV, with books, with anything that might take his mind off the mystery of the previous night, but nothing worked. As evening approached, Jack's anxiety reached a fever pitch. He paced the cabin, alternating between convincing himself he was overreacting and giving into wild theories about what could have happened. The scratches on his body were undeniable, as was the state he'd woken up in. Something had happened, something he couldn't explain or remember. Just as the sun began to set, Jack's phone buzzed with a news alert. His blood ran cold as he read the headline, "Hiker found dead in forest. Authorities suspect animal attack." With trembling fingers, Jack opened the article. The attack had occurred last night, in the same area where he worked. The victim had been torn apart, the wounds consistent with a large predator. But the police were puzzled. The injuries didn't quite match any known animal in the region. Jack sank onto his couch, the phone slipping from his numb fingers. He stared out the window at the darkening sky, his mind reeling with horrifying possibilities. Jack Thompson's fingers trembled as he clutched his coffee mug, eyes fixed on the small television in the break room of the logging company. The morning news blared, the anchor's voice grave as she detailed the latest development in the local tragedy. Authorities have identified the victim of last week's brutal animal attack as 28-year-old Emily Winters, an experienced hiker from Portland, the anchor reported. The attack occurred in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Forest, where Ms. Winters was on a solo camping trip. Officials are warning visitors to exercise extreme caution in the area. Jack's coworker, Mike, let out a low whistle. "Man, that's rough. Ain't that near where we've been working, Jack?" Swallowing hard, Jack managed a nod. "Yeah, just a few miles east of our current site." The news continued, showing footage of forest rangers and wildlife experts combing the area. Jack's stomach churned as he recognized familiar landmarks. It was all too close to home. In related news, the anchor continued, wildlife officials are puzzled by unusual tracks found near the attack site. Experts are debating whether they belong to an abnormally large wolf or potentially a non-native species that may have escaped captivity. At this, the break room erupted into speculative chatter. Jack remained silent, his mind racing. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, untouched. "All right, fellas, show's over," Bill, their supervisor, called out as he entered the room. "Time to head out. And remember, keep your eyes peeled out there. Buddy system at all times, you hear?" As the crew filed out, Jack lingered behind, lost in thought. Bill noticed his hesitation. "You okay, Thompson?" Bill asked, concern evident in his gruff voice. "You've been off since you came back from that sick day." Jack forced a smile. "Yeah, just, shaken up by the news. It's a lot to process." Bill nodded sympathetically. "I hear ya. It's got everyone on edge. Just stay alert out there, okay?" Throughout the day, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent his heart racing. He found himself scanning the forest floor, searching for any sign of the mysterious tracks mentioned in the news. During their lunch break, Jack overheard a group of his coworkers huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, I saw them myself," whispered Tom, the youngest of the crew. "Paw prints bigger than my hand, just on the edge of the clearing where we're working." "Bull," scoffed another logger. "You're seeing things, kid." "No, I swear," Tom insisted. And they looked fresh, like whatever made them had just passed through. Jack's blood ran cold. He wanted to dismiss it as the overactive imagination of a rookie, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Jack found himself staring up at the sky. The moon, though not yet full, seemed to loom larger than usual. An inexplicable sense of dread settled in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Eartha Jack," came a voice, snapping him out of his trance. It was Mike, looking at him with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You planning on staying out here all night?" Jack blinked, realizing the rest of the crew was already packing up. "Sorry, just lost in thought, I guess." Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, snap out of it. Sarah's waiting for you at the truck. Looks like she came to surprise you." Sure enough, as they approached the parking area, Jack saw his girlfriend Sarah leaning against his beaten-up Ford, a worried smile on her face. His heart sank. He'd completely forgotten they had plans that evening. "Hey, stranger," Sarah greeted him, pulling him into a hug. "Thought I'd come rescue you from another night of TV dinners." Jack returned the hug mechanically, his mind still miles away. That's great, thanks." As they drove back into town, Sarah filled the silence with chatter about her day at the local clinic where she worked as a nurse. Jack nodded at appropriate intervals, but his responses were monosyllabic at best. Finally, as they settled into a booth at the local diner, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. "Okay, Jack, what's going on? You've been acting strange for days now. Is this about that animal attack?" "Because I know it's scary, but it's not that," Jack interrupted, then immediately regretted his harsh tone. He softened his voice. "I mean, yes, partly. But it's complicated." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Her eyes searched his face, filled with concern. "Talk to me, Jack. Whatever it is, we can face it together." For a moment, Jack considered telling her everything, the blackout, waking up covered in blood, his growing suspicions. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? "I've just been having trouble sleeping," he said instead, hating himself for the lie. Nightmares, you know? About the attack, I guess. Sarah's face softened with sympathy. Oh, honey. Why didn't you say something sooner? I can ask Dr. Matthews about prescribing something to help you sleep. Jack shook his head. No pills. I'll be fine. It'll pass. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jack went through the motions, eating his meal and engaging in small talk, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of teeth and claws, heard the echo of inhuman howls. That night, after dropping Sarah off at her apartment with a promise to call her the next day, Jack returned to his cabin. The forest seemed to press in around him, the trees whispering secrets on the wind. As he prepared for bed, a beam of moonlight caught his eye. Jack found himself drawn to the window, staring up at the waxing moon. In just a few days, it would be full again. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Shaking off the strange feeling, Jack climbed into bed. But sleep proved elusive. He tossed and turned, plagued by vivid dreams that blurred the line between nightmare and memory. In one dream, he was running through the forest on all fours, faster than humanly possible. The scent of prey filled his nostrils, driving him forward with single-minded purpose. He could feel his body changing, muscles rippling and reshaping beneath his skin. In another, he stood over a fallen form, blood dripping from his hands, his claws. The face of the victim shifted between the hiker from the news and Sarah, their eyes wide with terror. Jack woke with a start, drenched in sweat and tangled in his sheets. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he could have sworn he heard a distant howl. As he lay there in the dark, trying to calm his racing thoughts, a chilling realization settled over him. These weren't just dreams born of stress and recent events. They felt like memories, fragmented and distorted, but undeniably real. What was happening to him? And more importantly, what would happen when the next full moon rose? With these unsettling questions swirling in his mind, Jack stared at the ceiling, dreading the approach of dawn and another day of pretending everything was normal. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be normal again. As the days crept by, Jack Thompson felt an increasing sense of unease. The full moon was approaching once again, and with it came a restlessness that seemed to seep into his very bones. He found himself pacing his small cabin, unable to sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. The night before the full moon, Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at the heavy chains he'd purchased from the hardware store. He'd told the cashier they were for securing equipment at the logging site. Now, as he ran his fingers over the cold metal links, he wondered if he was losing his mind. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. "I'm not. I can't be." But the memories of the last full moon, hazy and fragmented as they were, haunted him. The blood, the scratches, the inexplicable wounds on his body. He couldn't risk it happening again. With a deep breath, Jack began to secure the chains to his bed frame. The clanking of metal echoed through the quiet cabin, sounding ominous in the growing darkness. Once he was satisfied with the setup, he attached the other end to a sturdy leather cuff around his ankle. As the sun set, Jack felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through his body. His skin felt too tight, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. He could hear the scurrying of small animals in the forest outside, smell the pine sap oozing from the trees. "It's just anxiety," he told himself, trying to calm his racing heart. "Nothing's going to happen. You're going to wake up tomorrow morning, still in bed, and laugh at how paranoid you've been." But as the moon rose, full and bright in the night sky, Jack felt a surge of something. Energy, power. Whatever it was, it terrified him. He quickly locked the cuff around his ankle and lay down, squeezing his eyes shut. "Just sleep," he whispered. "Just sleep through it." Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Jack couldn't tell. The moonlight streaming through his window seemed to pulse, calling to something deep within him. His muscles twitched and spasmed, and a low growl built in his throat. The last thing Jack remembered was in searing pain that felt like his bones were reshaping themselves, and then, darkness. When Jack regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the cold. His eyes fluttered open to find himself not in his bed, but lying on the forest floor. Panic surged through him as he sat up, wincing at the soreness in his muscles. "No, no, no," he muttered, looking around wildly. He was deep in the woods, far from his cabin. The chains that had secured him to his bed were nowhere to be seen. As Jack stumbled to his feet, he noticed his hands. They were caked with dirt and something darker. His stomach lurched as he realized it was blood. Dried and flaking, but unmistakably blood. "Oh God," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "What have I done?" Jack's gaze darted around the clearing, searching for any clue to what had transpired during the night. That's when he saw the trees. Deep gouges marred the trunks of several pines surrounding him. He approached one, his hand shaking as he traced the marks. They were claw marks, far larger and deeper than any animal he knew of could make. A twig snapped behind him, and Jack whirled around, his heart pounding. But the forest was empty, silent except for the early morning birdsong. He took a deep breath, trying to orient himself. He needed to get back to his cabin, to clean up and figure out what to do next. As Jack picked his way through the underbrush, a sickening smell hit his nostrils. It was the metallic scent of blood, mixed with something rotten. Against his better judgment, he followed the odor. In a small clearing ahead, Jack froze. There, sprawled on the forest floor, was the mutilated carcass of a deer. Its abdomen had been torn open, entrails spilling onto the leaves. But it was the eyes that haunted Jack, glassy and wide, forever frozen in an expression of pure terror. Jack fell to his knees, retching. As the wave of nausea passed, panic set in. He couldn't remember anything from the night before, couldn't account for his actions. But the evidence was damning. "I did this," he whispered, horror and disbelief warring in his mind. I'm a monster." The sound of voices in the distance snapped Jack out of his daze. Hikers, maybe, or forest rangers. He couldn't let anyone see him like this. Jack scrambled to his feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the branches that whipped at his face and arms. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, finally stumbling to a stop when he recognized the outskirts of his property. Gasping for breath, Jack leaned against a tree, his mind reeling. What was he going to do? He couldn't go to the police, they'd think he was insane. And even if they believed him, what then? He'd be locked up, studied like some kind of freak. As Jack approached his cabin, he saw Sarah's car in the driveway. His heart sank. He'd completely forgotten they had plans that morning. "Jack?" Sarah's worried voice called out as she stepped onto the porch. "Where have you been?" "I've been knocking for, oh my God, what happened to you?" Jack looked down at himself, suddenly aware of his appearance. His clothes were torn and muddy, streaked with blood. Scratches and bruises covered his exposed skin. I went for an early morning hike," he lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I must have lost track of time. Took a bad fall on some rocks." Sarah rushed to him, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she examined his injuries. "These look serious, Jack." We should get you to the hospital." "No," Jack said, more forcefully than he intended. He softened his tone at Sarah's startled expression. "No, it's not as bad as it looks. I just need to clean up." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern and a hint of suspicion. "Jack, what's really going on? You've been acting strange for weeks now. I'm worried about you." For a moment, Jack considered telling her everything. The words were on the tip of his tongue, about the blackouts, the transformations, the growing certainty that he was turning into something inhuman. But the memory of the deer's terrified eyes flashed in his mind, and he swallowed the truth. "I'm sorry," he said instead. "I've just been under a lot of stress lately. With the animal attacks and everything. I guess I'm not handling it well." Sarah's expression softened. She reached out, cupping his face gently. "Oh, Jack. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? We're in this together." The tenderness in her touch nearly broke him. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Come on," Sarah said, taking his hand. "Let's get you cleaned up and I'll take a look at those cuts." As Sarah led him into the cabin, Jack's mind raced. He knew he couldn't keep this secret forever. Sooner or later, someone would discover the truth. But for now, all he could do was try to protect the people he loved from the monster he was becoming. Inside, as Sarah tended to his wounds, Jack caught sight of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw something else looking back at him, something with yellow eyes and sharp teeth. He blinked, and it was gone. But the image lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder of the beast that now lurked beneath his skin. As the adrenaline of the morning faded, exhaustion settled over Jack like a heavy blanket. He knew he should be figuring out what to do next, how to prevent another incident. But for now, all he wanted was to close his eyes and forget, just for a little while, the horror of what he had become. As he drifted off to sleep, Sarah watching over him with worried eyes, Jack's last conscious thought was a desperate prayer. "Please, let this all be a nightmare. Let me wake up and be normal again." But deep down, he knew there would be no waking up from this nightmare. Jack Thompson sat hunched over his laptop, the blue light from the screen casting an eerie glow on his haggard face. It was well past midnight, but sleep eluded him. Instead, he found himself diving deeper and deeper into the dark corners of the internet, searching for answers to the impossible question that plagued him: was he turning into a werewolf? "This is insane," he muttered to himself, scrolling through yet another website filled with folklore and myths. Werewolves aren't real. They can't be. But as he read account after account of people transforming under the full moon, of blackouts and unexplained injuries, Jack couldn't shake the creeping sense of recognition. It was all too familiar. A pop-up ad for silver bullets made him jump, his nerves frayed from lack of sleep and constant anxiety. Jack slammed the laptop shut, rubbing his tired eyes. "Get a grip," he told himself. "You're losing it, Thompson." The next morning, bleary-eyed and running on caffeine, Jack found himself at the local library. He hesitated at the entrance, feeling ridiculous. What was he doing here? But the need for answers drove him forward. "Can I help you find something?" the elderly librarian asked, peering at him over her glasses. Jack cleared his throat. Yes. I'm looking for books on folklore. Specifically, werewolves." The librarian's eyebrows rose slightly. "Research project?" "Something like that," Jack mumbled. She led him to a dusty corner of the library, gesturing to a small collection of books. "This is our occult and mythology section. It's not much, but you might find what you're looking for here." Jack thanked her and began scanning the titles. Lycanthropy through the ages, wolves in human skin, the beast within, a cultural history of werewolves. He pulled several books from the shelves and settled into a secluded corner to read. Hours passed as Jack pored over the texts, scribbling notes and cross-referencing accounts. But the more he read, the more frustrated he became. There were no concrete answers, no scientific explanations. Just stories, legends, and superstitions. One passage caught his eye. The werewolf, neither fully human nor fully beast, is cursed to walk between two worlds, belonging to neither. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. It was too close to how he'd been feeling lately. As he left the library, his mind swirling with half-formed theories and growing paranoia, Jack nearly collided with his best friend, Mike. "Whoa, easy there, Jack." Mike laughed, steadying him. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or should I say, a werewolf?" He gestured to the books in Jack's arms. Jack forced a smile. "Oh, these? Just doing some research. For a story I'm thinking of writing." Mike's eyes lit up. "No way. That's awesome, man. You always talked about writing that novel. What's it about?" "Werewolf romance. Werewolf detectives." For a moment, Jack considered confiding in Mike. They'd been friends since childhood. If anyone would believe him, it would be Mike. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he saw the amusement in Mike's eyes. He'd think it was a joke. "Just a classic monster story," Jack said instead. "Nothing special." Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, don't forget us little people when you're a famous author, all right? Hey, we still on for beers Friday night?" Jack nodded, already dreading the social interaction. "Yeah, sure. See you then." As Mike walked away, Jack felt more alone than ever. He had hoped talking to someone might help, but now he realized how impossible it would be to explain what was happening to him. The next day at work, Jack found it hard to concentrate. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, setting him on edge. He caught himself sniffing the air, picking up scents he'd never noticed before. "Hey, Thompson," Bill called out. "You planning on cutting that tree or just staring at it all day?" Jack blinked, realizing he'd been frozen in place, chainsaw idle in his hands. "Sorry, Bill. Just lost in thought." As he resumed work, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him. The trees seemed to whisper secrets on the wind, and every snapping twig made him jump. He felt like an intruder in a world he once thought he knew. During their lunch break, Jack sat apart from the others, picking at his sandwich. He overheard snippets of conversation from his coworkers. "Did you hear? They found more of those weird tracks near Miller's Creek. My cousin swears he saw something big moving through the trees last night. Says it wasn't no bear." Jack's hand trembled as he raised his water bottle to his lips. Could they be talking about him? Had someone seen him during his transformation? As the day wore on, Jack's paranoia grew. He felt like everyone was watching him, suspecting him. When Bill approached him at the end of the shift, Jack nearly bolted. "Jack, got a minute?" Bill asked, his tone serious. "Sure, what's up?" Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Bill sighed. "Look, I know things have been tough lately with all this animal attack business. But I need to know if you're okay to work. You've been distracted, jumpy. If you need some time off." "No," Jack said quickly. "No, I'm fine. Really. Just haven't been sleeping well. I'll do better, I promise." Bill studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. but if you need to talk, my door's always open." Jack thanked him and hurried to his truck, eager to escape the scrutiny. As he drove into town to pick up some groceries, he caught sight of his reflection in a shop window. He barely recognized himself. His eyes were wild, haunted, with dark circles underneath. His beard had grown unkempt, and his hair stuck out at odd angles. "Jesus," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. "I look like a madman." Inside the store, Jack moved quickly, grabbing essentials and avoiding eye contact with other shoppers. As he reached for a carton of milk, his hand brushed against someone else's. "Oh, sorry," he mumbled, looking up to see Sarah, his girlfriend. "Jack?" Sarah's voice was filled with concern. "Are you okay? You look terrible." Jack forced a smile. "Thanks a lot. Just working hard, you know." Sarah frowned. "You've been avoiding my calls." "I've been worried sick." Guilt washed over Jack. He had been pushing her away, afraid of what he might do if he lost control around her. "I'm sorry. Work's been crazy, and don't lie to me, Jack," Sarah interrupted. "Something's wrong. Please, talk to me." For a moment, Jack considered telling her everything. The words were on the tip of his tongue. But then he imagined the fear in her eyes, the disgust, the disbelief. He couldn't bear it. "I'm fine," he said, hating himself for the lie. "Really? I've just been stressed. But I promise, everything's okay." Sarah looked unconvinced, but nodded slowly. "Okay. But remember, I'm here for you. Whatever it is, we can face it together." As Jack watched her walk away, he felt a piece of his heart break. He was pushing away everyone he cared about, all to protect a secret he still couldn't fully believe himself. That night, as Jack lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind raced with everything he'd learned. The lore, the legends, the unexplained phenomena. None of it provided the answers he so desperately sought, but it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion: whatever was happening to him was real, and it was only going to get worse. As he drifted off into a fitful sleep, Jack's last conscious thought was a mix of fear and resignation. "I need to find a way to stop this, or I'll lose everything." The Timber Tavern was unusually crowded for a Tuesday night. Jack Thompson nursed his beer at the bar, trying to ignore the raucous laughter and clinking glasses around him. He'd come here seeking solitude, a brief respite from the constant fear and paranoia that had become his daily companions. But solitude, it seemed, was in short supply tonight. "I'm telling ya, it was no ordinary wolf," a gruff voice cut through the ambient noise, catching Jack's attention. He turned to see a grizzled old man holding court at the end of the bar, a small crowd gathered around him. Curiosity piqued, Jack slid closer, straining to hear over the din. The old man took a long swig of whiskey before continuing, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Been hunting these woods for nigh on 50 years, and I ain't never seen tracks like that before. Big as dinner plates, they were." "Ah, come on, Pete," someone in the crowd scoffed. "You've been telling tall tales again." Pete, the old hunter, slammed his glass down. "It ain't no tale. I tracked that beast for miles. Saw where it bed down, saw the carcasses it left behind. This weren't no natural predator, I'm telling ya." Jack's heart raced. Could the old man be talking about him? "So what do you think it was, Pete?" another patron asked, voice tinged with skepticism and alcohol-fueled bravado. "Some kind of monster?" Pete leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that Jack had to strain to hear. "You ever hear the old stories? The ones the loggers used to tell around the campfire? About the beasts that walk like men under the full moon? A chorus of groans and laughs erupted from the crowd. Werewolves? Come on, Pete, you're losing it. But Pete wasn't deterred. His eyes locked with Jack's for a moment, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Mock all you want, Pete continued. But I aim to bag me that wolf. Full moon's coming up in a couple days. That's when I'll get my chance. As the crowd dispersed, still chuckling at the old man's tales, Jack found himself moving closer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hoarse. This wolf you're tracking. Where exactly did you see those tracks?" Pete eyed him suspiciously. "Who's the skin?" "Jack Thompson. I work up at the logging camp." Jack extended his hand, which Pete shook after a moment's hesitation. "Thompson, eh?" "Yeah, I know your crew. Good men." Pete studied Jack's face. "You look like you've seen your share of trouble lately, boy. What's your interest in my wolf?" Jack swallowed hard. "Just curious. We've had some strange sightings up at the camp too. Thought maybe they were connected." Pete's eyes narrowed. "Well, if you're really interested, I could show you. Planning to head out at first light to check my traps. You're welcome to tag along, if you think you can handle it." The offer caught Jack off guard. This could be his chance to find some real answers, to see if there was any truth to his fears. But it could also be incredibly dangerous. What if he transformed while out in the woods with Pete? After a moment's hesitation, Jack nodded. "I'll be there." The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Jack met Pete at the edge of the forest, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The old hunter greeted him with a grunt and a thermos of strong coffee. "Hope you're ready for a long day, boy," Pete said as they set off into the woods. This ain't no nature walk. For hours, they trekked through the dense forest. Pete moved with a surprising agility for his age, pointing out signs that Jack would have missed entirely: a tuft of fur caught on a branch, a faint impression in the soft earth. As the day wore on, Jack found himself growing increasingly uneasy. The forest seemed different somehow, more alive. He could hear the scurrying of small animals, smell the rich earth and decaying leaves with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Here," Pete said suddenly, crouching down. "Look at this." Jack's breath caught in his throat. There, in a patch of mud, was an enormous paw print. It was easily twice the size of a normal wolf's, with long, sharp claw marks extending from each toe. "Jesus," Jack whispered. That's not possible." Pete looked up at him, his expression grim. "Told you it weren't no ordinary wolf. These tracks are fresh, too. Made sometime last night, I reckon." A chill ran down Jack's spine. Last night had been a full moon. He had no memory of what had happened after sunset. "We should keep moving," Pete said, rising to his feet. "Whatever made these tracks can't be far ahead." As they pressed deeper into the forest, Jack's unease grew. The trees seemed to close in around them, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees. Pete and Jack froze, eyes scanning the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Pete nodded, slowly raising his rifle. "Stay close, boy. And keep your eyes peeled." They moved forward cautiously, every step deliberate and silent. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, so loud he was sure Pete must be able to hear it. Another growl, closer this time. And then, in the shadows of a dense thicket, Jack caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Two eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow, stared back at him. "Pete," he hissed, There! But before Pete could react, the creature burst from the underbrush. It was massive, easily the size of a bear, but with the unmistakable shape of a wolf. Its fur was dark, matted with leaves and dirt, and its teeth gleamed wickedly in the fading light. "Run!" Pete shouted, raising his rifle. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, crashing through the forest with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at his face, leaving stinging cuts, but he barely noticed. All he could focus on was the sound of heavy breathing behind him, getting closer with each passing second. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The creature was gaining on him, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them. In that moment, Jack saw a flash of intelligence in its eyes that chilled him to his core. This was no mindless beast, there was something almost human in its gaze. Jack's foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling to the forest floor. He scrambled to his feet, certain that this was the end. But as he turned to face his pursuer, he found himself alone in a small clearing. The creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Gasping for breath, Jack spun in a circle, searching for any sign of the beast. But the forest had gone eerily silent. Even the birds had stopped their singing. "Pete?" Jack called out, his voice hoarse. "Pete, where are you?" No answer came. Jack was alone, lost in the deepening twilight of the forest. With no idea which direction would lead him to safety, Jack picked a path at random and started walking. Every snapping twig made him jump, every shadow held the potential for danger. As night fell, the forest transformed into a landscape of nightmares. It was well past midnight when Jack finally stumbled out of the tree-line and saw the welcome sight of his cabin. He ran the last few yards, slamming the door behind him and throwing the bolt. For a long moment, Jack stood with his back against the door, gasping for breath. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The creature in the forest, could it have been another like him? Or was it just a figment of his increasingly paranoid imagination? As the adrenaline began to fade, Jack became aware of a sharp pain in his side. He lifted his shirt to find 3 long, parallel scratches running across his ribs. Scratches that looked suspiciously like claw marks. With shaking hands, Jack retrieved his rifle from its rack and settled into a chair facing the door. He knew sleep would be impossible tonight. Every sound from the forest outside set his nerves on edge, convincing him that at any moment, the creature might come crashing through his door. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Jack's thoughts turned to Pete. Had the old hunter made it out of the forest safely? Or had he fallen victim to the very beast he'd been hunting? One thing was certain, Jack could no longer deny the reality of his situation. Whatever was happening to him, whatever he was becoming, it was far more dangerous and real than he had ever imagined. And if he couldn't find a way to control it, to stop it, he knew it was only a matter of time before he became the hunted instead of the hunter. As the days crawled by, Jack Thompson felt the pull of the approaching full moon like a physical force. It tugged at his bones, set his nerves on edge, and made his skin feel too tight. He found himself pacing his small cabin, unable to sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. The incident in the forest with Pete, the old hunter, had shaken Jack to his core. He hadn't heard from Pete since that day, and a part of him feared the worst. The local news had reported the hunter as missing, with search parties combing the woods. Jack's guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to come forward with what he knew, or thought he knew. On the third restless night, Jack's phone rang, startling him. It was Sarah. "Jack?" Her voice was tight with worry. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days." Jack ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I'm sorry, Sarah. I've had a lot on my mind. That's not good enough, Jack, Sarah said, her tone hardening. You've been pushing me away for weeks now. You're secretive, you're moody, and half the time I can't even get you to answer your phone. What's going on? Jack's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her everything about the blackouts, the transformations, the growing certainty that he was losing his grip on humanity. But the words wouldn't come. I can't explain it, Sarah, he said finally. I wish I could, but I can't. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore, Jack. I love you, but I can't be with someone who shuts me out like this. Whatever you're going through, you clearly don't want my help. Sarah, please, Jack pleaded, panic rising in his chest. I do want your help, I don't know how to explain what's happening to me. Then figure it out, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Because until you do, I can't be a part of your life. Goodbye, Jack. The line went dead, leaving Jack in stunned silence. He stared at the phone in his hand, feeling as if a vital part of himself had just been ripped away. Sarah had been his anchor, his connection to normalcy. Without her, he felt adrift in a sea of madness. The next morning, Jack dragged himself to work, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He was nearly an hour late, and Bill, his boss, was waiting for him with a thunderous expression. Thompson. Bill barked. My office, now. Jack followed him, his feet feeling like lead. As he sat across from Bill's desk, he could feel the older man's disapproving gaze boring into him. This is the third time you've been late this week, Bill said, his voice low and angry. And look at you, you're a mess. Are those scratches on your arms? What the hell is going on with you? Jack looked down at his arms, noticing for the first time the angry red marks that crisscrossed his skin. He had no memory of how he'd gotten them. I'm sorry, Bill, Jack stammered. I've been having some personal issues. It won't happen again. Bill leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Look, Jack, you've always been a good worker. But lately, it's like you're a different person. If you're in some kind of trouble, there are people who can help. For a moment, Jack considered telling Bill everything. But the absurdity of it all hit him anew. Who would believe that he was turning into some kind of monster? I appreciate that, Bill, Jack said. But I can handle it. I promise I'll do better. Bill sighed heavily. I'm sorry, Jack, but I can't keep making excuses for you. We've got a business to run here. I'm going to have to let you go. Jack felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. His job had been the last vestige of normalcy in his increasingly chaotic life. Now, even that was gone. As he walked out of the logging camp for the last time, Jack felt the eyes of his former co-workers on him. Their whispers followed him to his truck. Did you hear? Thompson got canned. Can't say I'm surprised. Guy's been acting weird for weeks. I heard he's mixed up in those animal attacks somehow. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove away. He had no destination in mind. He just knew he needed to get away from the pitying and suspicious looks. He ended up at the local diner, nursing a cup of coffee and staring blankly out the window. The television in the corner was tuned to the local news, and a familiar face caught Jack's attention. And in local news, the search continues for missing Hunter Peter Hawkins. Sheriff Johnson had this to say. The camera cut to the sheriff, a stern-faced man in his 50s. We're following all leads in Mr. Hawkins' disappearance. At this time, we can't rule out the possibility of foul play. If anyone has any information, we urge them to come forward." Jack's blood ran cold. He knew he should say something, tell them about that day in the woods. But how could he explain what he'd seen without implicating himself? Lost in thought, Jack didn't notice the sheriff enter the diner until the man was standing right next to his table. "Mr. Thompson?" The sheriff's voice made Jack jump. "Mind if I have a word with you?" Jack nodded mutely, gesturing for the sheriff to sit. As he did, Jack noticed the man's keen eyes taking in every detail, the scratches on his arms, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. "I understand you were one of the last people to see Pete Hawkins before he disappeared," the sheriff said, his tone casual but his gaze intense. Jack swallowed hard. "That's right. We went hiking together. But we got separated in the woods. I assumed he made it back okay." The sheriff nodded slowly. "And you didn't think to report that when he was declared missing?" I've had a lot on my mind lately," Jack said, knowing how weak it sounded. "I just heard about it on the news." The sheriff leaned back, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "You know, we've been getting a lot of reports of strange animal attacks lately. Livestock torn apart, hikers going missing. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Mr. Thompson?" Jack felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. "No, sir. Nothing at all." The sheriff held his gaze for a long moment before standing. "Well, if you remember anything about your trip with Pete, or if you see or hear anything unusual, you be sure to let us know. We'll be in touch." As the sheriff walked away, Jack let out a shaky breath. He knew he was running out of time. The full moon was tonight, and he had no idea how to control what was happening to him. That evening, Jack drove deep into the forest, far from any hiking trails or campsites. He parked his truck and hiked even further in, determined to keep as far from people as possible. As the sun began to set, he felt the familiar tingling in his bones, the tightening of his skin. "Please," he whispered to the darkening sky. "Please, not again." But his pleas went unanswered. As the full moon rose, pain ripped through Jack's body. He fell to his knees, crying out as he felt his bones shifting, reforming. His last conscious thought was a desperate hope that he was far enough away from civilization to avoid hurting anyone. When Jack regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the cold, damp stone beneath his naked body. He opened his eyes slowly, wincing at the dim light filtering into what he now realized was a cave. As his vision adjusted, horror washed over him. The cave floor was littered with bones, some old and bleached white, others fresher with bits of flesh still clinging to them. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, making Jack's stomach churn. Scrambling to his feet, Jack stumbled out of the cave, gasping for fresh air. His mind reeled as he tried to piece together what had happened. How far had he traveled? What, or who, had he attacked? As the reality of his situation crashed down upon him, Jack fell to his knees, a sob tearing from his throat. He had lost everything, his girlfriend, his job, his humanity. And now, it seemed, he had lost the last shreds of his control. With shaking hands, Jack picked up a sharp stone from the cave entrance. For a moment, he considered ending it all right there. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that there might still be hope if he could find a way to control the beast within, to understand what was happening to him. Dropping the stone, Jack began the long walk back to civilization. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't keep going on like this. Something had to change, or the monster would consume him entirely. As he walked, the forest seemed to whisper around him, secrets hidden in the rustle of leaves and the creaking of branches. The full moon hung heavy in the night sky, its silvery light filtering through the dense canopy of the forest. Jack Thompson stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had driven deep into the wilderness, hoping to isolate himself from any potential victims, but now he wondered if he had gone too far. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. As he pushed through a thick patch of ferns, Jack felt the first tremor run through his body. He fell to his knees, his hands digging into the soft earth. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "Please, not again." But his pleas went unheard. The moon's pull was too strong, the beast within too powerful to be denied. Jack threw his head back and screamed as the first wave of pain crashed over him. It started in his bones, a deep, searing agony that felt like they were being broken and reshaped. He could hear the sickening crunch of his skeleton shifting, elongating. His fingers curled into the dirt, nails lengthening into sharp claws that tore furrows in the forest floor. "Help me!" Jack cried out, though he knew no one was around to hear. His cries turned to whimpers, then to growls as his vocal cords transformed. Fur sprouted across his body, starting at his spine and spreading rapidly. His clothes tore as his muscles bulged and reshaped. Jack's face contorted in agony as his jaw elongated, teeth sharpening into deadly fangs. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, beyond anything he could have imagined. It felt as though every cell in his body was being torn apart and reassembled. In those moments of excruciating transformation, Jack Thompson ceased to exist. In his place, something new, something primal and terrifying, was born. As the pain began to subside, Jack, or what had once been Jack, rose to his feet. No longer a man, he stood on 4 powerful legs, his massive wolf-like body covered in thick, dark fur. His eyes, now a bright, unnatural yellow, scanned the forest around him. The world looked different through these new eyes. Every shadow held depth, every movement caught his attention. And the smells, they were overwhelming. He could scent every animal for miles, could practically taste the fear of the small creatures that scurried away at his presence. For a moment, the part of Jack that still clung to humanity tried to assert control. He shook his massive head, whining softly as he tried to remember who he was, why he was here. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of potential prey, and all thoughts of humanity were swept away by a tide of primal hunger. The werewolf that had once been Jack Thompson threw back his head and howled, the sound echoing through the forest. Then, with a burst of speed that would have been impossible for any natural wolf, he took off into the night. The forest blurred around him as he ran, his powerful legs eating up the distance. He moved with a fluid grace, navigating the dense undergrowth as if he had been born to it. In a way, he had been. This form, this speed, this power, it felt more natural than anything Jack had experienced in his human life. As he ran, the werewolf's keen senses picked up a myriad of scents and sounds. The musty odor of a fox's den, the rapid heartbeat of a rabbit hiding in its burrow, the distant rush of a stream. But one scent stood out above all others, the warm, rich smell of larger prey. Without hesitation, the werewolf changed course, following the tantalizing scent. His mind, clouded by hunger and instinct, no longer processed thoughts in any human sense. There was only the hunt, the chase, the kill. The scent grew stronger as he approached a small clearing. There, illuminated by the moonlight, stood a young deer. It was grazing peacefully, unaware of the deadly predator approaching. The werewolf slowed, his massive paws silent on the forest floor. He crouched low, yellow eyes fixed on his prey. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with explosive speed, he burst from the underbrush. The deer's head snapped up, its eyes wide with terror. It bolted, but it was already too late. The werewolf's jaws clamped down on its hind leg, razor-sharp teeth sinking deep into flesh and muscle. The deer's cry of pain was cut short as the werewolf dragged it down, powerful claws raking across its side. Blood, warm and coppery, filled the werewolf's mouth. The taste sent him into a frenzy, all vestiges of humanity forgotten in the thrill of the kill. It was over quickly. The werewolf stood over the fallen deer, his muzzle stained red with blood. He threw back his head and howled again, a sound of triumph and primal joy. As the echoes of his howl faded, the werewolf began to feed. He tore into the deer's flesh with savage enthusiasm, barely chewing before swallowing great chunks of meat. Blood matted his fur, but he paid no heed. There was only the feast, the satisfaction of hunger finally being sated. Hours passed as the werewolf gorged himself on his kill. Finally, satiated, he loped away from the gory remains, seeking water to quench his thirst. He found a small stream and lapped at it greedily, the cool water washing away some of the blood from his muzzle. As he drank, something stirred in the back of the werewolf's mind. A faint memory, a flicker of something that didn't belong to this primal form. For a moment, the yellow eyes reflected confusion, a hint of the man trapped within the beast. But then a twig snapped in the distance, and the werewolf's head snapped up, all traces of humanity once again submerged beneath animal instinct. He rose, powerful muscles rippling beneath his fur, and melted back into the shadows of the forest. The rest of the night passed in a blur of sensations and instincts. The werewolf roamed his territory, marking boundaries and chasing smaller prey more for sport than hunger. As the moon began to descend, he found a secluded cave and curled up to rest, his massive body easily filling the small space. As dawn approached, the transformation began again. Bones shifted and cracked, fur receded, and human awareness slowly returned. Jack Thompson came back to himself with a groan of pain, his naked body covered in dirt and dried blood. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What have I done?" Memories of the night flooded back, disjointed and dreamlike. The chase, the kill, the taste of blood, it all mixed together in a nauseating kaleidoscope of sensation. Jack stumbled out of the cave, falling to his knees and retching violently. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, Jack forced himself to his feet. He was miles from where he had left his truck, with no idea how to get back. Worse, he was naked and covered in evidence of his night's activities. "Think, Jack," he muttered to himself. "You need to get cleaned up and find your way back before anyone sees you." He made his way to the stream where he remembered drinking as the werewolf. The cold water was a shock to his system, but he welcomed it, scrubbing frantically at his skin to remove the crusted blood and dirt. As he washed, Jack's mind raced. The transformation had been more complete this time, the memories of his time as the werewolf more vivid. He had been aware on some level, but unable to control his actions. The realization made him feel sick all over again. "I can't keep doing this," he said aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet forest. "I'll end up killing someone. Or getting killed myself." But what could he do? He had no control over the transformations, no way to stop them. And who could he possibly turn to for help? Who would believe him? As Jack finished cleaning himself as best he could, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Voices, distant but getting closer. Hikers, by the sound of it. Panic surged through him. He couldn't be found like this, naked, confused, in the middle of nowhere. They'd think he was crazy at best, a murderer at worst. Jack dove into a thick patch of undergrowth just as two figures emerged into the small clearing by the stream. A man and a woman, both in their early 30s, dressed in hiking gear. "I'm telling you, I heard something," the woman was saying. "Like an animal in pain." The man laughed. "Probably just a squirrel or something. Come on, let's fill our water bottles and keep moving. We've got a long hike ahead of us." From his hiding spot, Jack held his breath, praying they wouldn't spot him. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure they must be able to hear it. As the hikers bent down to fill their bottles from the stream, the man suddenly frowned. "Hey, Sarah, look at this." Jack's stomach dropped as the man pointed to the bank of the stream, right where he had been washing off the blood. "Are those footprints?" the woman, Sarah, asked. "They look human, but odd." The man nodded, his expression growing serious. "And look there, is that blood?" Sarah gasped. "Do you think someone's hurt? Should we call for help?" "I don't know," the man said, reaching for his phone. "But something's not right here. We should report it, just in case." As the man dialed, Jack knew he had to move. Slowly, carefully, he began to crawl away from his hiding spot, using every ounce of his new heightened senses to avoid making noise. He had just made it to the edge of the clearing when a twig snapped under his hand. The sound, quiet as it was, might as well have been a gunshot in the silent forest. "What was that?" Sarah said, her voice high with alarm. "There's something in the bushes." "Hello?" the man called out. "Is someone there? Are you hurt?" Jack froze, his mind racing. Should he reveal himself? Try to explain? But how could he possibly justify his situation? Before he could decide, he heard the man speaking urgently into his phone. "Yes, I'd like to report a possible injury or something suspicious in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Forest. We've found what looks like bloody footprints and there's something in the bushes." That decided it. Jack couldn't risk being found. With a burst of speed that surprised even him, a lingering effect of his transformation, perhaps, he took off running through the forest. He heard shouts behind him, but he didn't slow down. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like jelly, putting as much distance between himself and the hikers as possible. Finally, when he could run no more, Jack collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. He was lost, exhausted, and still very much naked. But at least he had avoided discovery. For now. As his breathing slowed, Jack tried to get his bearings. The sun had risen higher, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill of fear that still gripped him. He needed to find his way back to his truck, to civilization. But more than that, he needed answers. "I can't keep living like this," he said to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need help. But who can I possibly turn to?" As if in answer to his question, a memory surfaced. Pete, the old hunter he had met in the bar. Pete, who had spoken of tracking an unnaturally large wolf. Pete, who had disappeared after their ill-fated expedition into these very woods. Jack's stomach churned with guilt as he remembered the sheriff questioning him about Pete's disappearance. Had he? No, he couldn't bear to finish that thought. But Pete had seemed to know something about what was happening in these woods. If he was still alive, maybe he could help. And if he wasn't, well, maybe Jack could at least find some answers in the old man's belongings. With this new goal in mind, Jack pushed himself to his feet. He needed to find his way back, clean himself up, and then track down any information he could about Pete's last known whereabouts. It took hours of wandering, using the sun's position and his vague memories of the previous night to guide him, before Jack finally stumbled upon the old logging road where he had parked his truck. he had never been so glad to see the battered old vehicle. In the truck's cab, he found the spare clothes he always kept for work emergencies. They weren't much, just an old flannel shirt and a pair of jeans, but after his night in the forest, they felt like the height of luxury. As Jack drove back towards town, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and plans. He needed to find Pete, or at least find out what had happened to him. But he also needed to be careful. The sheriff was already suspicious, and now there would likely be reports of a naked, bloody man running through the woods. One step at a time, Jack muttered to himself as he pulled into the driveway of his small cabin. Clean up, rest, then start looking for answers. But as he stepped out of his truck, Jack realized his plans would have to wait. There, sitting on his porch, was Sarah. His ex-girlfriend, the woman he had pushed away to protect her from the monster he was becoming. She stood as he approached, her face a mix of concern and determination. "Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. "We need to talk." Jack stopped in his tracks, suddenly acutely aware of his disheveled appearance, the lingering scent of the forest that clung to him. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" Sarah took a step towards him, her eyes scanning his face, taking in the scratches and bruises that he hadn't even realized were there. "I've been worried sick about you, Jack. You haven't been answering your phone, and when I went by the logging camp, they said you'd been fired. What's going on?" The concern in her voice nearly broke him. Part of Jack wanted to fall into her arms, to confess everything and beg for her help. But the memory of his night as the werewolf was still too fresh, the danger too real. "It's complicated," he said, running a hand through his tangled hair. "I've been going through some things, Sarah. It's better if you're not involved." Sarah's expression hardened. "Don't give me that, Jack Thompson. I've known you too long to buy your tough guy act. You're in trouble, aren't you? Is it drugs? Gambling? Whatever it is, we can face it together." Jack couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "I wish it were that simple. Trust me, Sarah, you don't want to know." "Try me," she challenged, taking another step closer. She was close enough now that Jack could smell her familiar perfume, could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. It took every ounce of his willpower not to reach out and touch her. For a moment, Jack considered telling her everything. But then he remembered the deer, remembered the savage joy he had felt as he tore into its flesh. No, he couldn't risk Sarah's safety. Couldn't bear to see the fear and disgust in her eyes if she knew the truth. "I can't," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I can't drag you into this. It's not safe." Sarah's eyes widened at his words. "Not safe? Jack, you're scaring me. Are you in some kind of trouble with the law?" Before Jack could respond, the sound of a car approaching made them both turn. Jack's heart sank as he recognized the sheriff's cruiser pulling up to his cabin. Sheriff Johnson stepped out of the car, his face grim. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his hand resting casually on his holster. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station with me. We have some questions about a disturbance in the forest this morning." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. This was it. They had found evidence of his transformation, of his night as the werewolf. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, an explanation, anything. Sarah looked between Jack and the sheriff, confusion and fear evident on her face. "Jack? What's going on?" But Jack couldn't find the words to respond. As the sheriff approached, reading him his rights, Jack realized that his fragile grasp on his double life was finally slipping away. The truth was about to come out, whether he was ready for it or not. As he was led to the sheriff's car, Jack caught one last glimpse of Sarah's face, a mixture of confusion, hurt, and something else. Determination, perhaps. He knew her well enough to know she wouldn't let this go, wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. And as the car pulled away, Jack found himself torn between fear of what was to come and a small, desperate hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth coming to light was exactly what he needed. Because one thing was certain, he couldn't continue on this path alone. One way or another, everything was about to change. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky when Jack Thompson regained consciousness. The world swam into focus slowly, his head pounding with a pain that seemed to emanate from every cell in his body. As his vision cleared, the first thing he saw was the carnage that surrounded him. He was lying in the middle of a field, the once lush grass now trampled and stained dark with blood. Scattered around him were the mutilated bodies of sheep, their white wool matted and torn, glassy eyes staring sightlessly at the lightening sky. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, making Jack's stomach churn. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What have I done?" As the fog of transformation lifted from his mind, fragments of memory began to surface. The hunt, the thrill of the chase, the savage joy of the kill. Jack retched, emptying the meager contents of his stomach onto the blood-soaked ground. A strangled cry made him look up. There, at the edge of the field, stood a man. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. A farmer, Jack realized with growing horror. The owner of the sheep. The man's face was a mask of terror and disbelief as he stared at Jack. What are you?" the farmer stammered, his voice shaking. "What have you done to my flock?" Jack tried to stand, but his legs were weak, uncooperative. He was acutely aware of his nakedness, of the blood that coated his skin and matted his hair. I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't control." But how could he explain? How could he make this man understand what he himself barely comprehended? The farmer took a halting step backward, his hand fumbling for something in his pocket. A phone, Jack realized. He was calling for help. "No, please," Jack said, finally managing to stagger to his feet. "You don't understand. I'm not a monster. I'm a man. I need help." But the farmer wasn't listening. His trembling fingers had managed to dial, and Jack could hear the tinny voice of the emergency operator on the other end of the line. There's something here," the farmer was saying, his eyes never leaving Jack. "It's killed my sheep. All of them. And now it looks like a man, but I saw. In the distance, Jack heard the wail of sirens. His heart raced. He couldn't be found here, couldn't face what would happen if he was caught. With a burst of desperate energy, he turned and ran, ignoring the farmer's shouts behind him. Jack crashed through the underbrush at the edge of the field, branches whipping at his face and bare skin. He had no idea where he was or which direction would lead him to safety. All he knew was that he had to get away, had to put as much distance between himself and the scene of his monstrous acts as possible. The sirens grew louder, seeming to come from all directions. Jack's lungs burned as he ran, his bare feet bleeding from the rough terrain. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. The memory of the farmer's terrified face, of the mangled sheep, drove him onward. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jack burst out of the woods onto a deserted country road. He paused for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to get his bearings. In the distance, he could see the lights of a small town. With no better options, he started moving in that direction, staying close to the tree line to avoid being seen by any passing cars. As he walked, the full impact of what had happened began to sink in. He had transformed again, had lost control completely. And this time, he hadn't just hunted wild animals. He had attacked a farm, had slaughtered domesticated animals. How long would it be before he hurt a person? The thought made him stumble, a wave of nausea washing over him. He leaned against a tree, trembling. "I can't do this," he whispered to himself. "I can't live like this." But what choice did he have? He couldn't turn himself in. Who would believe him? And even if they did, what would they do to him? Lock him in a cage? Experiment on him? The thought made him shudder. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack finally reached the outskirts of the town. He recognized it vaguely. He had passed through here a few times on logging runs. If he remembered correctly, there was a small motel on the edge of town. Keeping to the shadows, Jack made his way to the motel. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, that catered to truckers and drifters. Perfect for someone who needed to lay low. The bored-looking clerk barely glanced up as Jack entered the office. "Need a room," Jack said, his voice rough. The clerk looked up then, his eyes widening slightly at Jack's appearance. But to his credit, he didn't comment. "Cash only," he said. $50 a night." Jack nodded, reaching for the wallet he suddenly remembered he didn't have. I don't have any money on me," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "But I can get some. I just need a place to clean up. Please." The clerk studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. But you look like you're in a bad way. Tell you what, I'll give you a room for a couple hours. Get yourself cleaned up. But then you gotta go, all right?" Relief washed over Jack. "Thank you," he said fervently. "I won't forget this." The clerk tossed him a key. "Room 12. End of the row. There's a back entrance if you want to avoid being seen." Jack nodded gratefully and slipped out, making his way to the room. Once inside, he locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. He was safe, for the moment at least. The bathroom was small and dingy, but to Jack, it looked like paradise. He turned on the shower, not waiting for the water to heat up before stepping under the spray. He grabbed the small bar of soap and began to scrub, watching as the water at his feet turned pink with diluted blood. As he washed, Jack's mind raced. What was he going to do? He couldn't go home. The police would surely be looking for him there. He had no money, no clothes, no resources. And worst of all, he had no control over the monster inside him. Jack scrubbed harder, his skin turning red and raw under his desperate ministrations. But no matter how hard he washed, he couldn't seem to get clean. The memory of what he had done, of what he had become, clung to him like a second skin. Finally, when the water began to run cold, Jack stepped out of the shower. He dried himself with a threadbare towel, then wrapped it around his waist. Steeling himself, he approached the mirror above the sink. The face that stared back at him was barely recognizable. His eyes, usually a warm brown, now gleamed with an unnatural yellow tint. Dark circles marred the skin beneath them, and his cheeks were gaunt, as if he had aged years in a single night. But worse than the physical changes was the look in his eyes, haunted, desperate, with a hint of something wild lurking just beneath the surface. What am I becoming? Jack whispered to his reflection. The stranger in the mirror offered no answers. A sudden knock at the door made Jack jump. Hey, man, the clerk's voice called out. There's some cops asking questions in town. Thought you might want to know. Jack's heart raced. Thanks, he called back, his voice shaky. I'll be out soon. He heard the clerk's footsteps retreating and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He needed to move, and fast. But where could he go? As Jack pondered his limited options, his gaze fell on the small TV in the corner of the room. He switched it on, keeping the volume low, and was immediately confronted with his worst fears. A local news reporter stood in the field where Jack had woken up, the carnage clearly visible behind her. Authorities are baffled by what they're calling the worst animal attack in the county's history, she was saying. Eyewitnesses describe a large, wolf-like creature that was seen fleeing the scene. Local farmers are being warned to keep their livestock secured and to report any unusual sightings. Jack sank onto the bed, his legs suddenly unable to support him. They were looking for him, or rather, for the monster he became. It was only a matter of time before someone made the connection, before they tracked him down. As the reality of his situation sank in, Jack felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was alone, hunted, with nowhere to turn. The beast inside him was growing stronger with each transformation, and he was powerless to stop it. For a moment, Jack considered giving up. It would be easier, he thought, to turn himself in. To let them lock him away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. But the memory of the farmer's terrified face, of the suspicion in the sheriff's eyes, stopped him. They wouldn't understand. They'd treat him like a monster, like something to be studied or destroyed. No, Jack realized, he couldn't give up. Not yet. There had to be answers out there somewhere, had to be a way to control this thing inside him. And he was going to find it, no matter what it took. With renewed determination, Jack stood. He needed clothes, money, and a plan. But first, he needed to get out of this town before the police closed in. Wrapping the towel more securely around his waist, Jack cracked open the motel room door. The parking lot was empty, the morning sun casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. At the far end, he could see a line of dumpsters. Maybe, if he was lucky, he could find something to wear. Jack darted across the parking lot, his bare feet slapping against the hot pavement. He reached the dumpsters and began to rummage through them, trying not to think about how far he had fallen. After a few minutes of searching, he managed to find a pair of jeans that were only slightly too large and a faded t-shirt with a local beer logo on it. They smelled musty and were stained in places, but they were better than nothing. As Jack pulled on his scavenged clothes, he heard the distant wail of sirens. His heart raced. He needed to move, now. But where could he go? Jack's mind raced as he considered his options. He couldn't go home, that would be the first place they'd look. He had no family nearby, and he'd pushed away most of his friends in recent months as he struggled with his condition. Then, suddenly, a memory surfaced. Pete, the old hunter he'd met at the bar. Pete, who had spoken of tracking an unnaturally large wolf. Pete, who had disappeared after their ill-fated expedition into the woods. Jack's stomach churned with guilt as he remembered the last time he'd seen Pete. Had he been responsible for the old man's disappearance? He couldn't remember, and that terrified him more than anything. But Pete had seemed to know something about what was happening in these woods. If he was still alive, maybe he could help. And if he wasn't, well, maybe Jack could at least find some answers in the old man's belongings. Decision made, Jack set off down the road, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. He vaguely remembered Pete mentioning that he lived in an old cabin on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all he had. As Jack walked, the events of the past few months played through his mind like a nightmarish movie. The first transformation, waking up covered in blood with no memory of what had happened. The growing suspicion and fear as the full moon approached each month. The desperate attempts to contain himself, to prevent the monster from emerging. And through it all, the crushing loneliness. He had pushed everyone away, his girlfriend, his friends, his co-workers. All in a misguided attempt to protect them from the monster he was becoming. But in doing so, he had left himself with no one to turn to, no one to help him bear this impossible burden. Lost in his dark thoughts, Jack almost missed the turnoff for the dirt road that led into the woods. He paused, looking down the shadowy path. This had to be it. It matched the vague descriptions Pete had given of where he lived. Taking a deep breath, Jack started down the road. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. After about a mile, Jack saw a break in the trees ahead. As he emerged from the forest, he found himself facing a small clearing. And there, nestled against the tree line, was a cabin. It was old and weathered, its wooden walls gray with age. A small porch sagged slightly, cluttered with rusty tools and old animal traps. This had to be Pete's place. Jack approached cautiously, his senses, still heightened from his recent transformation, alert for any sign of danger. But the clearing was silent save for the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Pete?" Jack called out as he reached the porch. "Pete, are you here?" "It's Jack Thompson. We met at the bar a few months back." No answer came from within the cabin. Jack tried the door and found it unlocked. With a creak of rusty hinges, it swung open. The interior of the cabin was dim, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. It smelled of old leather, gun oil, and something else, a musty, animal scent that made the hair on the back of Jack's neck stand up. "Pete," he called again, stepping further into the cabin. But it was clear that no one had been here for some time. A fine layer of dust covered every surface, undisturbed. Jack's heart sank. He had hoped, against all logic, that Pete would be here. That the old hunter would have answers, would know how to help him. But the empty cabin only served to remind Jack of how alone he truly was. As Jack's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he began to take in the details of the cabin's interior. The walls were covered in animal pelts and mounted heads, trophies from a lifetime of hunting. But interspersed among these familiar sights were stranger things. Old books with titles in languages Jack didn't recognize. Jars filled with odd-colored liquids and what looked unsettlingly like preserved animal parts. And everywhere, scrawled on scraps of paper and pinned to the walls, were notes and drawings. Jack approached one of the walls, squinting to read the faded handwriting. The notes were a jumble of observations, theories, and what looked like excerpts from old legends. Many mentioned the moon, its phases carefully tracked and annotated. Others spoke of transformations, of men becoming beasts. He knew, Jack whispered, a chill running down his spine. "Pete knew about what I am." As Jack scanned the walls, his eye caught on a particular drawing. It showed a human figure contorted in pain, partially transformed into a wolf-like creature. The detail was incredible, as if drawn from life. Below the image, in Pete's shaky handwriting, was a single word, lycanthrope. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He had suspected, had feared, but seeing it written out so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He was a werewolf. A monster out of legend and nightmare. With trembling hands, Jack began to gather up the notes and books. If Pete had known about his condition, maybe there were answers here. Ways to control the transformations, to suppress the beast within. As he moved around the cabin, collecting anything that looked relevant, Jack's foot caught on something. He looked down to see a trap door, partially hidden beneath a worn rug. Curiosity overrode caution, and Jack pulled the rug aside. The trap door was heavy, but Jack managed to heave it open. A musty smell wafted up from the darkness below, along with that same animal scent he had noticed earlier. Stronger now, almost overpowering. Jack hesitated for a moment, then descended the rickety ladder into the cellar. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he fumbled for a light switch. When he found it, the sight that greeted him made him stumble back in shock. The cellar was a macabre workshop. Tables were cluttered with arcane tools and more jars of unidentifiable substances. But what drew Jack's attention were the cages. Large, sturdy cages that lined one wall, each big enough to hold a man or a wolf. And in the largest cage, huddled in the corner, was a figure. For a moment, Jack's heart leapt. Was it Pete? Had the old hunter somehow trapped himself in his own cage? But as Jack approached, he realized it wasn't Pete. The figure was smaller, emaciated. And as it turned to look at him, Jack saw that its features were a horrifying blend of human and wolf. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of decay and impending frost as I made my way through the dense forest. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet, each step a reminder of the fragile nature of my humanity. It had been 3 months since my first transformation, and the weight of my curse grew heavier with each passing day. As I neared the edge of the woods, I caught sight of a group of people gathered near the ranger station. Their voices carried on the wind, and I instinctively ducked behind a large oak tree, my heart racing. I strained to hear their conversation, my newly heightened senses picking up every word with unnerving clarity. "All right, listen up, everyone," a gruff voice commanded. I recognized it as belonging to Sheriff Hank Dawson, a man I'd known since childhood. "We've got a serious situation on our hands. The attacks have been escalating, and it's time we put an end to this once and for all." I peered around the tree trunk, careful to remain hidden. The sheriff stood before a group of about 20 people, a mix of local law enforcement, wildlife experts, and what appeared to be professional hunters. My stomach churned as I realized the gravity of the situation. A tall, lean woman with short gray hair stepped forward. She carried herself with an air of authority that commanded respect. "I'm Dr. Elena Reeves from the Department of Fish and Wildlife," she introduced herself. "We've been tracking these incidents for the past few months, and I can say with certainty that we're dealing with something unusual." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might give away my position. "What do you mean by unusual, Dr. Reeves?" Sheriff Dawson asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Dr. Reeves pulled out a tablet and began swiping through a series of images. "The attack patterns we've observed don't match any known predator in this region. The level of violence, the size of the paw prints, the strength required to inflict such damage, it's all off the charts." She paused, her eyes scanning the group before continuing. "We found traces of DNA that, well, frankly, we can't explain. It's as if we're dealing with some kind of hybrid creature." A chill ran down my spine as I listened. They were closer to the truth than they realized, and the thought terrified me. "Are you saying we're dealing with some kind of monster?" a young deputy piped up, his voice tinged with disbelief. Dr. Reeves shook her head. "I'm a scientist, deputy. I don't deal in monsters or myths. What I'm saying is that we're facing an unknown predator, one that poses a significant threat to public safety. That's why we've brought in some additional help." She gestured to a rugged-looking man standing off to the side. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and predatory. "This is Jack Hawthorne, a renowned wildlife tracker and big game hunter. He's agreed to assist us in locating and neutralizing the threat." Hawthorne nodded curtly, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Make no mistake," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Whatever we're dealing with, it's dangerous. I've hunted all over the world, and I've never seen anything like the carnage in those reports. We need to approach this with extreme caution." Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "All right, folks. Here's the plan. We'll break into teams and set up a perimeter around the areas where the attacks have been concentrated. Dr. Reeves and her team will focus on gathering evidence and setting up trail cameras. Hawthorne will lead a tracking team to try and locate the creature's den or hunting grounds." He paused, his expression grim. "I don't need to tell you how important this is. People are scared, and they're looking to us for answers. Let's do this by the book and bring this thing in, alive if possible, but use whatever force necessary to protect yourselves and others. Any questions?" A nervous-looking wildlife officer raised his hand. "Sir, what exactly are we supposed to do if we encounter this creature?" Hawthorne stepped forward, his eyes glinting. "You call for backup immediately. Do not engage alone. We'll be using tranquilizer darts as a first option, but I'll have a team armed with high-powered rifles as a last resort. Remember, this thing has already killed. It won't hesitate to do so again." My mind raced as I processed the information. They were organizing a full-scale hunt, and I was the prey. The irony wasn't lost on me, the hunter becoming the hunted. But these people had no idea what they were truly dealing with. They couldn't possibly understand the battle raging inside me, the constant struggle to maintain control over the beast that lurked beneath my skin. As the meeting broke up and the teams began to disperse, I slipped deeper into the woods. I needed to find a way to protect myself, and others, from what I might become when the full moon rose tonight. The day passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. I spent hours roaming the forest, my senses on high alert for any sign of the search parties. Occasionally, I'd catch a whiff of unfamiliar scents or hear the distant crackle of a radio, reminding me that I wasn't alone in these woods. As twilight approached, I found myself drawn to a secluded clearing I'd discovered during one of my previous transformations. A small cave nestled at the base of a rocky outcropping offered some shelter, and I hoped it might contain me, or at least slow me down, when the change came. I paced nervously at the mouth of the cave, watching as the sky slowly darkened. The first stars were just beginning to appear when I heard a twig snap nearby. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I strained to identify the source of the sound. "Over here." "I've got tracks," a voice called out, much closer than I'd anticipated. Panic surged through me as I realized I had been so focused on the impending transformation that I'd let my guard down. I ducked into the cave, pressing myself against the cool stone wall as footsteps approached. "Hold up, Jenkins," another voice cautioned. I recognized it as belonging to Jack Hawthorne. "Let me take a look." I held my breath as the hunter crouched at the entrance of the cave, his flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. He was so close I could smell the gun oil on his clothes and the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his skin. "These are fresh," Hawthorne murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of a footprint, my footprint, in the soft earth. "Human, but there's something off about the gait. Almost like they're favoring all fours. What do you think it means?" Jenkins asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and fear. Hawthorne stood slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. "It means our target might be more than just an animal. We need to proceed with extreme caution. Radio the others and let them know we've found signs of recent activity in this area." As Jenkins moved away to make the call, Hawthorne took a step closer to the cave entrance. I pressed myself further into the shadows, willing myself to become invisible. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to shine his light directly into my hiding spot. But then a sound echoed through the forest, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't me, I was still in human form. But I knew that sound. It was the call of a true wolf, and it had just unknowingly saved me from discovery. Hawthorne's head snapped in the direction of the howl. "Jenkins, did you hear that?" "Yes, sir," the younger man replied, jogging back to Hawthorne's side. "What do you think? Could that be our target?" The hunter shook his head slowly. "No, that was a regular wolf. But it might draw our quarry out. Animals are territorial. If there's another predator in the area, our target might respond to the challenge." He turned to Jenkins, his expression serious. "Radio Dr. Reeves. Tell her to get her team ready with the tranquilizers. We're going to use this to our advantage." As the two men moved away from the cave, discussing strategy in low voices, I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. But my reprieve was short-lived. A familiar ache began to spread through my bones, and I knew with grim certainty that the transformation was about to begin. I stumbled deeper into the cave, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the first waves of pain washed over me. I bit down on my fist to muffle my cries, knowing that any sound could bring the hunters running. As my body began to contort and change, my mind raced with desperate thoughts. How could I protect these people from the monster I was about to become? How could I ensure that I didn't hurt anyone when the beast took control? The sound of approaching voices outside the cave only heightened my panic. I could hear Dr. Reeves giving instructions to her team, their equipment clanking as they set up what sounded like a makeshift command post. "Remember, we want to take this creature alive if at all possible," Dr. Reeves was saying. "The tranquilizer darts are loaded with a potent mixture designed to take down large predators. Aim for the body mass. We need a clean shot for the drug to take effect quickly." "And if the tranks don't work?" a nervous voice asked. There was a pause before Dr. Reeves responded. "Then we defer to Mr. Hawthorne and his team. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. This could be the zoological discovery of the century, and I'd prefer to study it alive." As they continued to discuss strategy, my transformation accelerated. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles stretched and bulged, and coarse fur sprouted across my body. I bit down on my arm to stifle a scream as my face elongated into a muzzle filled with razor-sharp teeth. The final stages of the change were always the most agonizing and the most dangerous. As my human consciousness began to fade, replaced by the primal instincts of a wolf, I used the last vestiges of my willpower to drag myself as far back into the cave as possible. "Please," I thought desperately as darkness clouded my vision. "Please don't let me hurt anyone. Please don't let them kill me." And then, with a final, wrenching spasm, the transformation was complete. Where a man had crouched moments before, a massive, snarling beast now stood. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness as the werewolf raised its head and sniffed the air, catching the scent of humans nearby. With a low growl, it padded towards the cave entrance, drawn by the promise of prey. Outside the cave, the search team continued their preparations, unaware of the danger that lurked mere feet away. "All right, listen up," Jack Hawthorne addressed the group, his voice low but commanding. "We've got movement on the thermal imaging cameras. Something big is in that cave, and it's going to be coming out soon. Remember your training. No heroics. If you don't have a clear shot, don't take it." Dr. Reeves nodded in agreement. "We want to minimize stress on the animal as much as possible. A calm target is easier to hit and less likely to react aggressively." As if on cue, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the cave entrance. The search team froze, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Holy shit, Jenkins whispered, his hand tightening on his tranquilizer gun. "What the hell is that?" Hawthorne raised a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving the cave mouth. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Let it come to us." "Dr. Reeves, are your people ready?" The scientist nodded, her face pale but determined. "Ready as we'll ever be." For a moment, everything was still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the darkness. Then, with a bone-chilling roar, the werewolf burst from the cave. It was a sight that would haunt the dreams of everyone present for years to come. Standing nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, the creature was a terrifying amalgamation of man and wolf. Rippling muscles bulged beneath its thick, dark fur. Razor-sharp claws extended from massive paws, and its muzzle was filled with gleaming fangs. But it was the eyes that struck terror into the hearts of the search team. Glowing an unnatural yellow, they burned with an intelligence that was decidedly inhuman, a predatory awareness that seemed to see right through them. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. "Fire! Fire the tranks!" Dr. Reeves shouted, her scientific detachment crumbling in the face of the impossible creature before them. The air filled with the soft pop of tranquilizer guns as multiple darts flew towards the werewolf. But the beast was faster than anyone could have anticipated. It dropped to all fours, dodging most of the projectiles with preternatural speed. 2 darts found their mark, embedding themselves in the werewolf's thick hide. It roared in pain and fury, yellow eyes scanning the group for the source of its discomfort. "Did we get it?" Jenkins asked, his voice shaking. "Is it going down?" Hawthorne shook his head grimly. "No. Those darts were designed to take down a grizzly. This thing's barely phased." As if to prove his point, the werewolf charged forward, scattering the search team. People screamed and dove for cover as massive claws swiped through the air, barely missing flesh. "Use lethal force," Hawthorne bellowed, raising his high-powered rifle. "Take it down!" The crack of gunfire split the night as Hawthorne and his team opened fire. But the werewolf was a blur of motion, its enhanced speed and strength allowing it to stay just ahead of the bullets. In the chaos, Dr. Reeves found herself separated from the group, backed up against a large oak tree. She fumbled with her tranquilizer gun, trying to reload with shaking hands. The werewolf's head snapped towards her, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. With a snarl, it lunged, covering the distance between them in 2 massive bounds. Dr. Reeves screamed, raising her arms in a futile attempt to protect herself. But the killing blow never came. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in those inhuman yellow eyes. A spark of recognition, a glimmer of humanity fighting to reassert itself. The werewolf's claws stopped mere inches from Dr. Reeves' face. It stood frozen, muscles trembling with the effort of restraint, hot breath washing over the terrified scientist. "My God," Dr. Reeves whispered, her scientific mind racing even in the face of mortal danger. "You're in there, aren't you?" "The human, you're still conscious." A pained whine escaped the werewolf's throat, and for a second, the eyes that met Dr. Reeves' gaze were filled with an all-too-human anguish. But the moment passed quickly. The sound of approaching footsteps and shouted orders broke the connection. The beast snarled, its head whipping around to face the new threat. "Elena! Get down!" Hawthorne's voice rang out. Dr. Reeves dropped to the ground just as a barrage of gunfire erupted. The werewolf roared in pain as bullets tore into its flesh, dark blood matting its fur. But even wounded, the creature was far from beaten. With a mighty leap, it cleared the heads of the approaching hunters, landing on all fours several yards away. "Don't let it escape!" Hawthorne shouted, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. But it was too late. The werewolf bounded into the darkness of the forest, its speed allowing it to outdistance its pursuers in moments. For several minutes, the only sounds were the harsh breathing of the search team and the fading crash of underbrush as the werewolf fled deeper into the woods. Is everyone all right? Sheriff Dawson asked, his voice shaky as he emerged from behind a fallen log. A chorus of affirmatives rang out, though many voices trembled with shock and residual fear. Dr. Reeves stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Hawthorne approached her, concern etched on his weathered features. "Elena, are you hurt?" "Did it touch you?" he asked, scanning her for any signs of injury. She shook her head, still dazed. "No, I'm fine." "Jack, did you see? Did you see its eyes?" Hawthorne frowned. "I saw a monster that nearly tore you apart." "What are you talking about?" "It stopped," Dr. Reeves insisted, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "It could have killed me, but it stopped." There was recognition in its eyes. Intelligence. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed incessantly, their harsh glare amplifying my disorientation. My clothes were disheveled, caked with dried mud and what I feared was blood. The events of the past night swirled in my mind like a tempest, fragmented and chaotic. I stumbled towards the front desk, my legs barely supporting my weight. "Can I help you?" The officer behind the desk eyed me warily, his hand instinctively moving towards his holster. I gripped the edge of the desk, steadying myself. I need to confess," I stammered, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. The officer's eyebrows shot up. "Confess to what, exactly?" "I think I've done something terrible. Last night, the full moon. I can't remember everything, but I woke up covered in blood. There was so much blood." My words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. The officer's expression shifted from weariness to skepticism. "Sir, have you been drinking? Or perhaps taking any substances?" I shook my head vigorously. No, you don't understand. I think I might have hurt someone. Or killed them. I'm not sure, but I need to turn myself in." A deep sigh escaped the officer's lips. He turned to his colleague, a heavy-set man with a salt and pepper mustache. "Hey, Johnson, can you come here for a sec?" As Johnson approached, the first officer spoke in a low voice. "We've got another one. Full moon brings out all the crazies." My heart sank. They didn't believe me. How could they, when I barely believed it myself? Johnson addressed me, his tone patronizing. "Sir, why don't you have a seat over there? We'll get you some water, and maybe you can tell us what's really going on." I slumped into the hard plastic chair, my head in my hands. How could I make them understand when I didn't fully understand it myself? The fragments of memory flashed through my mind, the searing pain as my body contorted, the primal hunger that consumed me, the taste of copper in my mouth. "Here's some water," Johnson said, placing a paper cup in front of me. "Now, why don't you start from the beginning?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. It started about a month ago. I was hiking in the woods outside of town when I heard this strange howling. For the next hour, I poured out my story. The attack in the woods, the gradual changes I had noticed in myself, the blackouts during the full moon, and finally, the horror of waking up covered in blood. With each word, the officer's expressions grew more incredulous. When I finished, silence hung heavy in the air. Johnson cleared his throat. "That's quite a story, Mr. Hawkins," I supplied. "James Hawkins." "Right, Mr. Hawkins. Look, I can see you're distressed, but we can't just arrest you based on, well, this. He gestured vaguely. Do you have any evidence of a crime? Any missing persons you know of? I shook my head, deflated. No, but then I'm afraid there's not much we can do, the first officer cut in. Maybe you should go home, get some rest. If you're still concerned, you might want to talk to someone professional. The dismissal in his tone was unmistakable. They thought I was crazy, and perhaps I was. But the blood had been real. Thank you for your time, I mumbled, rising unsteadily to my feet. As I turned to leave, Johnson called out. Mr. Hawkins? Take care of yourself, all right? And if you do remember anything concrete, don't hesitate to come back. I nodded numbly and pushed through the station doors into the harsh sunlight. The world seemed too bright, too normal. How could everything just go on as if nothing had happened? My feet carried me home on autopilot, my mind reeling. If the police wouldn't believe me, who would? As I approached my house, I saw my sister's car in the driveway. A wave of dread washed over me. How could I face my family like this? I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the knob. Before I could decide whether to enter or flee, the door swung open. My sister, Sarah, stood there, her face a mask of worry and relief. James, where have you been? We've been worried sick. She pulled me into a tight hug, then stepped back, her nose wrinkling. God, you smell like you've been rolling in a swamp. What happened to you? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I explain this to her? To any of them? Sarah's expression softened. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. Mom and Dad are in the living room. She led me inside, her hand on my arm as if she feared I might collapse at any moment. As we entered the living room, my parents' faces mirrored the same mix of relief and concern I'd seen on Sarah's. James, thank goodness, my mother exclaimed, rushing to embrace me. We were about to call the police. My father hung back, his brow furrowed. Son, where have you been? This isn't like you. I sank onto the couch, the weight of their expectations crushing me. I need to tell you something. All of you. But you have to promise to hear me out, no matter how crazy it sounds. They exchanged worried glances but nodded. And so, for the second time that day, I recounted my horrifying tale. I spoke of the attack in the woods, the gradual changes, the blackouts, and the blood-soaked awakening. With each word, their expressions grew more alarmed. When I finished, silence filled the room. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. James, sweetheart, are you feeling all right? Maybe we should take you to see Dr. Miller. I'm not sick, Mom, I insisted. I know how it sounds, but it's true. Something happened to me out there in the woods, something unnatural. My father leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Son, what you're describing, it's not possible. Werewolves don't exist. There has to be a rational explanation for what you've experienced. But the blood dash I began. Sarah cut me off. James, you were missing all night. You could have hurt yourself, or maybe you had some kind of psychotic break. It happens sometimes, especially after traumatic events. I looked from face to face, seeing only disbelief and concern. They didn't believe me either. A part of me couldn't blame them. If our positions were reversed, would I believe such an outlandish story? I'm not crazy, I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. My mother reached out, squeezing my hand. No one's saying you're crazy, dear. But you've been through something traumatic, and it's affected you. We want to help you. Help me? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. How can you help me when you don't even believe me? My father's voice took on an edge of frustration. James, listen to yourself. Werewolves? Full moon transformations? This isn't some horror movie. Something is clearly wrong, and we need to get you proper help. I stood abruptly, unable to bear their pitying looks any longer. I need some air, I muttered, heading for the door. James, wait! Sarah called, but I was already out the door. I walked aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and despair. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the familiar streets of my hometown. How many times had I walked these paths, feeling safe and secure? Now, every shadow seemed to harbor a potential threat, not from others, but from the monster lurking within me. As night fell, I found myself at the edge of town, staring into the depths of the forest where it all began. The trees loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Somewhere in those woods, a month ago, my life had changed irrevocably. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart racing. It was only a raccoon, scurrying away into the underbrush. But the surge of adrenaline brought with it a chilling realization: I couldn't stay here. As long as I remained, everyone I loved was in danger. With a heavy heart, I turned back towards town. I knew what I had to do. The house was quiet when I returned. A note on the kitchen table informed me that my parents had gone to consult with Dr. Miller, our family physician. Sarah had reluctantly left for her night shift at the hospital, extracting a promise from our parents to call her if anything changed. I climbed the stairs to my room, each step feeling like lead. How many times had I ascended these stairs, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited me? Now, each creak of the floorboards seemed to mock me, a reminder of the normal life I could never return to. In my room, I pulled out an old duffel bag from under the bed. With mechanical efficiency, I began to pack clothes, toiletries, some non-perishable food. My hands trembled as I reached for my wallet and passport. Where would I go? It didn't matter, as long as it was far away from here, far from anyone I could hurt. As I zipped up the bag, my eyes fell on a framed photo on my nightstand. It was from last Christmas, my parents, Sarah, and me, all smiling brightly. A lump formed in my throat. Would I ever see them again? Could I bear to leave without saying goodbye? In the end, cowardice won out. I couldn't face them, couldn't bear to see the fear and disbelief in their eyes one more time. Instead, I sat at my desk and penned a letter. Dear Mom, Dad, and Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you don't believe me about what's happening, and I don't blame you. It sounds insane even to my own ears. But I know what I experienced, and I can't risk staying here and potentially hurting someone I love. I'm sorry for leaving like this, but it's the only way I can protect you. Please don't try to find me. I don't know where I'm going, but I'll do my best to find help and figure out what's happening to me. I love you all more than I can express. Please forgive me. James. I placed the letter on my pillow, where they would be sure to find it. Then, with one last look around the room that had been my sanctuary for so many years, I shouldered my bag and crept downstairs. The house was still empty, for which I was grateful. I couldn't have borne a confrontation now. As I stepped out into the cool night air, a sense of finality washed over me. This was it. I was leaving behind everything I'd ever known, embarking on a journey into uncertainty. My old pickup truck sat in the driveway, a faithful companion through countless adventures. Now, it would be my getaway vehicle. I tossed my bag into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the suburban night. As I pulled out of the driveway, I allowed myself one last look at the house. The windows were dark, the facade peaceful. How long would it be before they discovered I was gone? Would they understand why I had to leave? I drove through the sleeping town, past familiar landmarks that now seemed alien and foreboding. The high school where I'd graduated just a few years ago. The park where I'd had my first kiss. The diner where my family gathered every Sunday for brunch. Each sight was a stab of pain, a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. As I approached the town limits, I saw the forest looming ahead. The same forest where, a month ago, my life had changed forever. I slowed the truck, pulled over to the side of the road, and cut the engine. For a long moment, I sat there, staring into the darkness between the trees. Somewhere in those woods, the creature that had attacked me still roamed. Was it watching me now? Did it know what it had done to me? A shiver ran down my spine as a memory surfaced, the searing pain of teeth tearing into my flesh, the inhuman howl that had echoed through the night. I rubbed my shoulder unconsciously, feeling the raised scar tissue beneath my shirt. Why me? I whispered into the darkness. Why did you choose me? Of course, there was no answer. Only the whisper of wind through the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I started the engine again, my resolve strengthened. I had to find answers, had to understand what I had become. And most importantly, I had to find a way to control it before I hurt someone. As I pulled back onto the road, I caught one last glimpse of the woods in my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me from between the trees. But when I blinked, they were gone. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the night. I had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between myself and everything I loved. The unknown loomed ahead, filled with both terror and possibility. As the now leading sign flashed past, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer James Hawkins, the small-town boy with a bright future. That James had died in the woods a month ago. Now, I was something else, a fugitive, a monster, a mystery even to myself. The full moon hung low in the sky, a silent witness to my exodus. Its pale light seemed to mock me, a constant reminder of the curse I now carried. I pressed down on the accelerator, as if I could outrun its baleful gaze. Hours passed, and the landscape changed. Rolling hills gave way to flat prairies, then to craggy mountains in the distance. I drove without stopping, fueled by a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and my old life. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I had made it through the night without incident. Perhaps, just perhaps, I could learn to control this thing inside me. I pulled into a truck stop, my body aching from the long drive. As I stepped out of the truck, stretching my cramped muscles, a news broadcast from a nearby radio caught my attention. And in local news, authorities are investigating a gruesome discovery in the woods outside of town. The remains of what appear to be several deer were found by hikers early this morning. Rangers say the animals seem to have been killed by a large predator, possibly a bear or mountain lion. Residents are advised to exercise caution when venturing into the forest. My blood ran cold. Deer remains, killed by a large predator. Could it have been me? Was this what I had done during my blackout? I leaned against the truck, my legs suddenly weak. The magnitude of what I was dealing with hit me anew. This wasn't just about me anymore. If I couldn't control this thing inside me, I could be a danger to everyone around me. A trucker emerging from the diner gave me an odd look. "You all right there, son? You're looking a bit peaky." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just long drive." "Thanks." He nodded sympathetically. "Been there, Buddy, get yourself some coffee, it'll do you good. As he walked away, I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. I couldn't afford to fall apart now. I needed a plan. I made my way into the diner, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. As I slid into a booth, a waitress approached, her name tag identifying her as Dolores. "What can I get for you, hon?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Just coffee, please," I replied. "And, do you have a map I could look at?" She raised an eyebrow. "Lost, are we?" I chuckled weakly. "You could say that." Dolores disappeared for a moment, returning with a steaming mug of coffee and a well-worn road atlas. "Here you go, sugar. You let me know if you need anything else." I thanked her and opened the atlas, my eyes scanning the pages without really seeing them. Where could I go? Where would be safe, not just for me, but for those around me? As I sipped my coffee, my gaze fell on a vast expanse of green on the map. The Canadian wilderness. Miles and miles of uninhabited forest. If I could make it there, perhaps I could isolate myself, find a way to cope with my condition without putting others at risk. It was a long shot, but it was the best plan I had. I memorized the route, then closed the atlas. As I reached for my wallet to pay for the coffee, my hand brushed against